Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Melanie Boyer, and I have the opportunity to serve as the Program Director for Alabama Humanities Foundation. I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to our directors. Joining us is Rebekah Davis, Archivist for Limestone County. Today, she's going to share with us a story about sisters and suffrage. Rebekah?
All right, thank you. So I'm really glad to be here today. Let me see if I can get my screen shared for y'all. Let's see. So y'all can see what I see. Let's see, share. All right. And move this around. There we go. Okay. As she mentioned today, I want to talk to y'all a little bit about what the voting looked like in Limestone County. As you're probably aware, this year marks 100 years since women got the right to vote. Since the 19th Amendment was ratified, and so whenever we look at that, as this year we started looking at that, it made me think, I wonder what it was like in Limestone County for these women who wanted to vote. So to jump right into it, let's see, there we go. So just to give you an idea of the place in time, when the movement towards women's suffrage really kind of got its start in a lot of ways in July 1848, when the first women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. And about 20 years later, Wyoming was the first state to grant women's suffrage. And so, but it wasn't as these things were going on the national stage, it wasn't until the 1890s that things started to heat up in Alabama. And you had women's advocacy groups form up in Alabama. You see down there at the bottom, this is a picture from our archives. These are the Athens College suffragettes. Now, if you're familiar with Athens State University here in Athens, Alabama, it's the oldest university in the state, and it was established in 1822 as a women's college. And by the time that 1912 rolled around, you had a lot of women from other areas coming in to join, and we'll see how that kind of played out as well. That was the same year that the Equal Suffrage Association was founded in Birmingham. It wasn't until 1919 that Congress passed the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. And then, of course, it went to the states to vote up or down whether or not they were going to ratify this. So it was in September that that it came to Alabama, and Alabama rejected it. Alabama legislators said, we don't want women to have the right to vote. But in August of 1920, it was ratified after all. August 18th, which happens to be my sister's birthday, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify, and it was passed. Now, 2 days later, as we'll see, the Tennessee filibusterers came to Limestone County. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And in October of 1920, though, Lucy Graham was the first to register in Limestone County. Over the course of 2 weeks, 698 women registered. And in November of 1920, women voted in their first U.S. presidential elected. Republican Warren Harding was voted president, but Alabama voted Democrat, as they tended to do back then, for James Cox. It wasn't until 1953 that Alabama finally officially ratified the 19th Amendment. So to give us a little bit more background, this newspaper is actually from the Philadelphia Evening Public Ledger, and this was describing what was going on around the country. And this is where folks in Alabama actually made national headlines, because if you see there where I have highlighted Tennessee court issues injunction to stop suffrage, the anti-suffragists made national headlines after Harry T. Byrne changed his vote from no to yes to break a tie in the Tennessee House. By the way, that was after he got a letter from his mama saying, you be a good boy and do the right thing and vote the right way. I know you'll do it. And the Tennessee General Assembly voted to ratify it. Well, everyone was shocked. And so these 36 legislators jumped on a train, at the L&N Depot, bound for Alabama. They still had red roses on their lapels to signify that they were anti-women's suffrage. And they did this to prevent a quorum in the General Assembly so that they could rescind the vote on constitutional technicalities. Well, they took the L&N Railroad all the way down to Decatur to stay for a week. But first, they stopped here at what is now the Limestone County Archives at the Athens Passenger Station. They got off the train at 2 p.m. And I'm broadcasting from the station today. And so let's see, I'm going to see if I can pause this for just a moment. Let's see, and get to where I can see my, I can't see my screen. Let's see. I want to be able to show y'all and make sure you can see what I see. I can't see my, let me stop sharing. Wait, resume share. I'm sorry, y'all. Here we go. Let's see. I'm having technical difficulties. Here we go. Okay, now then. All right, so that you all can see what I see. I'm in what at that time was the colored waiting room of the L&M Passenger Depot. This community was very segregated. So we're going to walk through, and I will walk through and show you all as we go through. That is now my office, and also registration. This is what was the ticket window. As a matter of fact, you can actually see the old ticket windows there. And as we come in here, we are now in the general waiting room, which is now our reading room. You can see some of those that's one of the old train benches that was original. If you look, you can see there's a picture of the train depot whenever it was in operation at that time. This would have been taken just a little bit before 1920. So this was the general waiting room. In there was the ladies' waiting room, which is now the assistant archivist's office, because never the twain shall meet. We had, this was very segregated in a lot of ways. Men, women, colored, all kept separate. And so this is the community and the train station where these men disembarked for their day in Athens. Now, thank you for your patience as I tried to figure out all that sharing. Now, let me go back to sharing my screen and back to our presentation. Okay, so when they got here to Athens, you see this picture of ONeal Park. The Colonel W.T. Sanders gathered up all the men in the town to roll out the red carpet for Hall's Red Rose Brigade, as they were called. That's what Limestone Democrat editor Robert Henry Walker called them when he wrote this article here about them coming, and he called them the incorrigible exiles from the Tennessee Capitol. So this train of autos, or convoy of autos, met the train, and they all rode out to ONeal Park in West Limestone for a watermelon feast and a foot race between the Democrats and the Republicans before they returned to Athens College, of all places, where a splendid dinner had been prepared for them. Oh, can you not see my screen? I'm sorry. Let's see. Escape. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing everything today. Okay. Now share screen. Ah, there we go. Okay. Now I'm guessing y'all can see my screen. There we go. Okay. Let me go back to my presentation. Okay, all right, is that better? All right, so y'all see ONeal Park, it was pretty. There's the newspaper. So they all went out to Athens, to ONeal Park, came back to Athens College to have this splendid, where it said a splendid dinner had been prepared for these gallant defenders of masculine privileges. So it was at this dinner that Confederate veteran Jack Skidmore, quote, presenting some very convincing arguments against the amendment and couching his attacks in the most forceful language, he swept the table with his rapid fire heavy artillery and brought the audience to his feet. And that's when he said, I fought to the last ditch of the 60s and I am going to do the same now. He will do it to keep these women from voting. Also at this dinner, Charles W. Sarver expressed the willingness of Athenians to, oh, I'm on mute. I'm sorry, y'all. Never mind. Okay, I'm getting notices, so y'all share me. Y'all let me know if you can't hear me. Okay, so Charles W. Sarver expressed the willingness of Athenians to shelter the Tennesseans at any and all occasions. So I want y'all to remember those names, Walker and Sarver, because you will hear them again. So at the end of the day, the Tennessee men dubbed their Limestone County supporters, quote, the Alabama branch of the Tennessee legislature. Now, while all this was going on, once the Tennessee filibusterers spent their time in Alabama, their plans were thwarted. The 19th Amendment passed. And so by October, Robert Henry Walker, you see him there, the Limestone Democrat editor, was running articles letting women know it was time to register. This first one on October 7th mentioned it would be something new under the sun. He said, he kind of teased the women, saying it would be very unique to witness them as they register and swear to their ages. And you almost kind of hear him sort of snickering, saying, and their weights too. But then by October 14th, his tone had changed just a little bit. He said time was short, and he said, therefore, it behooves every patriotic, home-loving woman to get busy and register. And the last paragraph of this editorial says, nothing is more important just now than getting the women registered. Wide-awake women should inform themselves as to the movements of their board of registrars and go to meet them without fail. So, and then I thought it was interesting, a week later, while women were registering, he had to run this little editorial about Tennessee women and their first jury. And he said, naturally, they tempered justice with mercy, as women are wont to do. Meanwhile, registration notices were running in the newspaper. And so this one ran on early in October, letting women know that they needed to register. The commercial club and the courthouse was open 6 days a week for women to be able to register to vote. And then you had the League of Women Voters was running these ads just every week, and both the Limestone Democrat and the Alabama Courier here in Athens, reminding women, you need to vote, this is how you do it, this is why it's important, kind of taking them through the steps. And the October 14th editorial noted that the very first woman to register was Lucy Graham, and it told a little bit about her, and we'll come back to her. So by October 28th, the Limestone Democrat reported that 698 women had registered to vote, just in time to vote in the presidential election of November 2nd. And with that, the following week was the results of this election. And so there were this was not on the front page of the paper, these women voting. It was relegated to the editorials and the personals. And in the editorials, it noted that it was unusual sight, and the most extraordinary part was the utmost congeniality between the married people as they went forward to cast their ballots. Anti-suffragists had pictured this home-wrecking dissension over politics, but the trouble never appeared, whether the wives really are democratic in their beliefs or under perfect control. No one knows, but Cox was a guest favorite in the female balloting here. And there was also a notice in the personals. It was one sentence that was squeezed but sandwiched between notices about Miss Florence Tarrentine's appendicitis and the frost killing off the last of the late cotton. So that was the notice of the big monumental event here in Limestone County of women voting for the first time. So with that, I want to start looking at who were these women who registered to vote. And to give you an idea about what kind of brought me to this, I know it'll be small, but I want you to all see this. Of course, you see I'm actually in the archives. You see all these old books behind me. This book right here, this is the poll tax record of 1920. And it lists the very first women who registered to vote. And this is a big, heavy book. And I don't know if you can see, but at the very top, the very first woman who registered was listed as Sarah Frazier, with COL in parentheses and underlined. She was the only one in this first book who was noted as being an African American woman who registered to vote. And so in the course of trying to figure out who she was, I found out a lot of things about these women. Now, there were 700 women who registered. We're not going to go through them all, but I want to highlight a few and know that there are many more stories that can be told. So the first one is Lucy Graham. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of her. You can see this gorgeous picture of a garage, which is not very good quality, but I'll tell you why it's there. So Lucy was a Limestone County employee like me, but she was sort of the Limestone County employee extraordinaire. She was a clerk in probate judge George Malone's office. She was the sister of the license inspector, and she was the first one to probably just walk downstairs and register to vote. And a year after that, just to kind of give an idea of what her life ended up being like, she married World War I veteran Rip Lunsford, and together they ran this place, Lunsford's Garage. And I'd like to think she had at least a little bit of influence on this scene, because if you look over to the right, you can see a big sign that says ladies restroom inside. So I'd like to think Lucy might have had something to do with making this place a little bit more congenial for women. Next, these are an interesting crew right here. These are the teachers, some of the teachers at Trinity School. Now, Trinity School was the school established in 1865 by the American Missionary Association to educate the freed former slaves. And it operated all the way up until 1970. It was the only high school for African Americans for 105 years in Limestone County. And many of the women who first came and followed them later were missionaries from up north who had come down to the south. And the white teachers really were not that much accepted by the white community because of what they were doing. But most of them we see in their letters and correspondence, they were very passionate about education and opportunities from African Americans. And so in this picture, if you look on the top left of this group, that's Louise Allen. She was the principal at Trinity at the time. In the top middle, you've got May Addison, who was a teacher there and also registered to vote in 1920. And then over on the far left, the African American teacher there, who is Annie Mitchell, and she also was one of the first registrants to vote. To go a little bit deeper into some of these women, starting with Miss Allen, here's a picture of her in front of the Trinity School. She came here in 1909 and presided over the school for 31 years. In her obituary, her friend described her as a saint according to any yardstick anyone cares to apply. She was born in Brooklyn, grew up in Connecticut, and when she was training to become a teacher, she learned of this AMA work in the South. And she always said the Negro spirituals actually inspired her to enter the AMA Southern field as a missionary. Now, in her tenure as principal and during the time she was registering to vote, she wore many hats. She presided over chapel and academic lessons, vocational training. She fixed problems with the furnace, and she delved into missionary barrels to share clothing with community members. When after the building burned in 1907, shortly before she came, she presided over the new building. When that one burned, she presided over the building of this building behind her in 1913. And she just had this perspective of kind of a sculptor. She said, there's an angel in every one of our boys and girls. We have seen it with the sculptor's vision, and it is with exceeding great joy that we hack away day after day at the stony prison of sin and ignorance, and watch the lines of beauty appear one by one until a lovely character steps forth, or a remarkable intellect. And she retired in 1940, died in 1951. In her obituary, it also said she crowned the procession of New England Congregational Christian women who went south to help freed men become free men. And I'd like to think she also worked to make freed women become free women. And you see that in the fact that she and all these other women from Trinity went together to the courthouse, strength in numbers, to register to vote. Another one of those was Annie Mitchell, as she was in that first picture you saw. This is a picture of her in her classroom at Trinity. She was born here in Alabama, graduated from Trinity and then Talladega College, and she devoted her life to teaching at Trinity School for at least 30 years until the school went to Miller Elementary. Ella McKissack, she's one of my favorites. So this is her over here on the right, and her husband, William McKissack. We'll get to that here in a minute. She was born Ella Bell Nelson in Mississippi. And although she was born after the end of slavery, she worked as a household servant. And her mother died when she was 5 months old, her father soon afterwards. When her mother died, she gave her to her former mistress. And so when she was 6 years old when her mistress and she moved to Alabama, and she said she couldn't speak to colored people. Her mistress did not want to know her about books, but she secretly taught herself how to read and write. And when she was about 15 years old, another young African-American lady, young girl, would sneak in the backyard and come see her and speak to her. And she told her, "You need to come to Trinity." And so she told her mistress she wanted to go, and her mistress said, "Okay, sure." But when fall rolled around, she said, "Oh, I can't afford the $1 tuition. Sorry." So Ella just said, "Okay, I'm leaving." And she left, and she joined the household of this little girl who was probably one of the Malones, and went to live with them. She worked at the school, sweeping and dusting the chapel to earn part of her tuition. She sewed to make more money to be able to provide for herself. And she studied so hard, she actually was able to start teaching the very next year at a little country school. She finished at Trinity, went on to Fisk University, and spent many years as a home demonstration agent. During this time, in 1908, she married Alexander Collier, and he was a local African-American doctor who had gotten his degree up in Nashville and practiced here in Athens. They had 2 children, and then he died in 1913. She raised those kids by herself for 7 years until just a couple months before she registered to vote, she married William McKissack. And this is him on the left next to this bridge. By 1930, though, she was listed as widowed in the census. But here's the thing. William wasn't dead. 2 years later, in 1932, he actually filed for divorce and said she had left him, and they divorced. She never remarried, but she stayed in Athens as a home demonstration agent, a Negro home demonstration agent, ministering to the Negro community. Until at least 1946, because at that time she was speaking to a group of farmers about home dairying, farmers and extension agents from all over the area. So she ended up being very independent. She basically just chose her own path. And I'd like to think registering to vote was just one in a long line of acts of independence for her. One little note about this picture before I move on. The class of 1930 of Trinity gave this bridge to Trinity as sort of a graduation present to cross the moat of what it had been Fort Henderson, a Union fort there. And it was there on campus. It was built there. And so Will Alice Townsend was a senior who designed it, and then William McKissack actually built it. You can still walk across that bridge today if you're ever coming up to Athens and visit the Trinity Fort Henderson complex. So if you want to walk across that Trinity Bridge, you can still do that today. It's still standing. So McKissack, he did good work. All right, that gets us to Sarah Frazier. Like I said, she's the one who originally piqued my interest. Unfortunately, I was not able to find a picture of her. But what I have here is the census for 1920, and then this photo here of Otha Frazier and Mac Frierson. So Sarah, if you look at the census in 1920, she was married to John Frazier. John was the son of Otha Frazier here, and this was a second marriage for both of them. They had married in 1912, And this photo of Otha Frazier, the back of it says that he was given his freedom before the Civil War. He had been a slave to a Dr. Malone, but he was set free actually before the Emancipation Proclamation. And then this little boy, Mac, born in 1914. Otha Frazier is kind of famous around these parts because he was an expert shoemaker. He was an expert woodsman and hunter. In fact, here at the I meant to pull it out, but I won't unless we have time. We actually have at the archives one of his hunting knives and hunting horns that he crafted himself. And he made shoes for soldiers on both sides during the war. After the war, nearly all of his children and grandchildren went on to Trinity. And John was one who was educated at Trinity, and then by 1920, the census lists him as a shoemaker. And so apparently he followed his daddy into the business. Now, remember that name, Mac Frierson, because clearly Frazier and the Friersons were close. The Friersons were a very prominent white family here in town, and that name will come up again. And so I'd like to think there's a connection there that may have encouraged Sarah to be one of the first people to go register to vote. Next, we get to our first set of sisters. We have a lot of sisters that all register just boom, boom, boom in groups together in these poll tax records. The Bailey sisters in 1920, this is Virginia. She was 38. Her sisters Zoe, 32, and Nana Bell, 29, lived with her, as well as did two young female cousins. It lived in Limestone County together. Virginia was a farmer. Zoe was a teacher. Nana was a homemaker. Nana was pretty independent. In our records here, we see that in 1911, her father actually petitioned that she no longer be considered a legal minor. And a man named Perry Henderson testified that Nana was a young woman of mature judgment. And so the petition was granted. She could legally buy and sell real estate, sue and be sued, all of those things you could do at 21, which was the age of majority at that time. And she took advantage of that. I found this is kind of a small thing, but these sisters, I don't believe any of them ever married from what I could tell. They lived together, and I think were just sort of ride or die homies, because in 1930, I saw that all three sisters together sued a man named B.T. Wells to recover, and they listed a 9-year-old black mule named John, an 8-year-old horse named Tom, a Jersey cow named Jersey, another cow named Jersey, a Jersey heifer, 2 wagons, 2-horse plow, all the farming tools that he had. And apparently they were able to recover these things that they needed to do their job that Mr. Wells was hanging on to. So they kind of stood up for themselves as well in court and in other ways. Edith and Pearl is the first of a few sisters-in-law I want to talk about. So I don't have everybody specifically identified in this picture, unfortunately, but this is the Miller family. Ellis was an ice dealer. He was married to Edith. They both had come here from Ohio. And Forrest was a lumber dealer. He had also come from Ohio. He married Lillian Pearl. She went by Pearl, from Indiana, and they had a daughter and 2 sons by 1920. And you see here is the actual Miller Lumber and Ice Company that their husbands ran. And the Millers were part of an influx of people from up north, Ohio, Indiana, other parts north, who came kind of flooding into Limestone County after the turn of the 20th century, when L&N, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, had invested so much into this area. They built this building in 1905, another depot in Athens, the freight depot in 1911 or 14, I get those mixed up. And then they solicited people to come. And so with these people coming in from up north and other parts, they also brought not only population growth, but a lot of progressive ideas, like giving women the right to vote. And then just for the fun of it, the Millers also like to party. This is a picture of the Millers' tacky party that they hosted at their house. And among the women in this scene are Pearl Miller and also Kate Chambers, who was a friend of theirs, and you'll see again. the Ida Flood over here on the right. Now, Ida was working in Rosenau Store. This is a picture of the store. Dave, Max and Dave, you'll hear them. Max and Dave Rosenau, you'll hear them again as well. They ran this store in the early 1900s. They were one of several families who, Jewish families who came here around that time. Rosenau, Jaffe, Markowitz, Steinberg. There were several that were here at this time, and Ida worked for them and apparently might have been friends with their wives as well. Lavella and Blanche are another set of sister-in-laws. So they were married to the Sarver brothers, Charles W. on the left and Joe on the right. Now, if you recall the name Charles W. Sarver, he was one of the men who stood up at the dinner at Athens College when the Tennessee filibusterers came and said, we're going to support you, whatever you need. And yet his wife and sister-in-law were two of the first ones to register to vote. The Sarvers were very popular Aggies. They were graduates of the agricultural school that was the predecessor of what is now Athens High School. And Charles actually ran successfully for mayor in 1923. I'd like to think Lavella voted for him and Blanche did and maybe helped him with his campaign. And was very popular and successful mayor and postmaster right up until he got into a little bit of trouble and killed himself in the basement of the post office. So after that, Lavella, she never remarried. She lived and so on with her, did her life on her own. But that's who they were. This next lady I find interesting because of what she also went through. Bertha Morris, this is her on the left, and I can't help but think of this couple as a bit of a Bonnie and Clyde because the back of this photo says, John Morris murdered B.F. Doc Grisham at a barbecue in 1904. And then it goes on to tell about John's and Bertha's birth and death dates. So in the newspaper, it reported in 1904 under the headline, Slain at Barbecue. I'm going to read this because they just don't report murders like they used to. All right, so it says, called one of the bloodiest and most deplorable affairs that has disgraced and horrified the people of this county. At a quiet gathering of women and children, where mirth and pleasure should have reigned supreme, where there should have been no event but that of social pleasure, we find the smell of wildcat whiskey and hear the crash of firearms. And after the smoke of battle, we find one of the most prominent and respected citizens of the community and county cold in the embrace of death, slain by the leaden messenger from the revolver of a man who had been a neighbor and a friend. So apparently John and Bertha both were at this picnic out in West Limestone when Doc had to order out a man who had, quote, imbibed too freely of the flowing bowl. And John Morris's dad, John Sr., took exception to that, and they fought, and John Jr. just reached around Doc Grisham and shot him 3 times in the heart. Well, then, everybody who was anybody was at this picnic apparently, because Will McClellan, who was the nominee for county superintendent of education, tried to wrestle the gun away, and John Sr. shot him in the back. And then Constable A.J. Vaughn was there. He tried to break it all up. They shot him in the face. And officers showed up at the scene, arrested John Sr. and his other son, Walter. John Jr. ran. Bertha, I don't know what she was doing with all this, but I cannot imagine it could have been an easy time for her. 3 days later, Wash Johnson found John asleep in a cornfield on Johnson's farm and brought him to the jail, and I guess claimed the $250 reward they were offering for him. Now, interestingly enough, John Morris appears to have never served time, from what I could find, for this incident, for this murder, for this killing. In 1909, after a series of trials, he was again found guilty and sentenced to serve 4 years, but the judge set aside the verdict and ordered a new trial. And apparently he never did any time then, because on October 23rd, 1918, early in the morning, John went to his office as a Standard Oil Company agent. His office was at the Lime Cola bottling plant here in town. He said hello to R.B. Stonestreet, who was working in that building, shut his office door, and shot himself in the head. And so Stonestreet and a janitor heard it, rushed in. It was too late. The front page obituary listed Bertha as his survivor, said excellent traits of character, and was a man who easily made and retained friends, and they couldn't understand it. Of course, it didn't mention anything about the killing previously either. But Bertha never remarried. She never had any children, but in 1920, as a widow, she did register to vote. Now, R.B. Stonestreet, as I said, was the one who found John. This is his family. This is his wife, Mary, on the right when she was a young woman. And then her seated when she was an older woman with her 3 daughters. You've got, let's see, Josephine on the right, and then Coralie on the left, Emma in the middle. And Mary and Josephine registered to vote together. Apparently Coralie and Emma registered later. They had all moved here from Kentucky. His name was Rochester Stonestreet. They moved here from Kentucky. Apparently these sisters were close all their lives and did a lot of this stuff together. You can see them together with their mother. And Josephine and Coralie, sadly, even died together. They had gone out to a fruit stand on Highway 72 and pulled out, and it's still a dangerous blind curve to this day. And a truck hit them, and they both died together. Josephine was 77, and Coralie was 83. So it was a sad ending for these women who had apparently been so close. Gertrude Nelson, I don't know a whole lot about her, but I do like this photo. Just a little note that she was a Davis, and she married William Nelson on Valentine's Day, 1900. And Judge Horton Sr. was the one who signed off on the marriage. She apparently never had kids. They stayed married until William died, and she never did remarry, but she did register to vote. Daisy Malone, this beautiful young woman, married William W. Malone in 1914. They had Billy. You see her there with Billy on the right. What you don't see is William, because in June 1929, by June 1929, he had left. And in 1931, she filed for divorce and child support. And from that point on, she was able to successfully raise Billy on her own. The Crawford Sisters, they're here with their friends earlier before the 1920. Catherine and Elizabeth, or Lizzie, were 2 sisters who registered to vote together. Lizzie, we'll see her again. Another set of sister-in-laws, Alice and Blanche. This is Alice Rosenau. If you remember the name Rosenau from Rosenau Store, she was married to David Lee, and Blanche was married to his brother Max that ran the store together. They had come to Athens in 1865 and to help their family run a store here, and stayed, and actually David Lee Jr. became a longtime judge here. But I can't help but think that Alice, his mama, might have helped with his campaign as well. But they might have also been friends with Ida Flood, who registered to vote. Kate Chambers, just a quick picture of her. She was at the tacky party, and there she is with her family. She was a member of the First Christian Church, and a lot of these church ladies all kind of went together to vote. Here's one of my favorites. And you see on the left, Anna Hobbs Frierson. This proof from 1923 is all the family have of her at that time, but I kind of like that it says original across it, because she was a pretty original lady. She married John Frierson first, and they had that little boy Macklin, if you remember from the picture with Otha Frazier. And then John died in 1914. So in 1922, while he was running for judge of the 8th Judicial Circuit, she remarried Judge James E. Horton. If you recognize that name, he was the one who ended up presiding over the Scottsboro Boys trial. If you haven't seen last week's presentation, go back and watch that, and you can find out a whole lot more about that. But during the Scottsboro Boys trial, Samuel Leibowitz, the defense lawyer, wrote a long letter to Judge Horton, and at the end of it, though, he said, "I've had the good fortune to visit with you and your gracious and charming lady at your home in Athens." And this is kind of how she was known. When she died, her obituary said, "Come unto me," the master said. And Miss Anna, as she was affectionately known, laid down her work, and with a cheery smile and wave of the hand, she wandered into an unknown land, and left us dreaming how very fair it must needs be, since she lingers there. It noted that she was missed in all these activities of her church, home, civic, and community life. These were very dear to her heart, and she served them faithfully. Memory Walker. If you recognize the last name Walker, it's with good reason. This is her on the left with her friend Lizzie Crawford, one of the sisters who we saw voting earlier. On the right with another set of her friends, and here in the middle, she always seemed to have that determined set about her face. Even when she was a much older woman, she was the daughter of Robert Anderson McClellan, a very prominent man in town and a Confederate veteran who wrote the definitive history of Limestone County back in the 1800s. And Aurora Pryor was her mother, two very prominent families. She was very active in the community, and she was also married to Robert Henry Walker. I'd like to think perhaps she was Robert Henry's silent editor when you look at how his tone kind of changed from the first article he wrote to the last, but that's just speculation. But I do know that from everything we know about her, she was a very strong and a leader in the community. The Martin ladies, we got here Mama, Nana, Della, Maca, and Gladys, who were all married into or born into the Martin family of Limestone County. And I've actually been working with one of the Martin family members on writing a book, publishing or editing a book about the Martin family. And this family, now they were fairly prominent as well. A lot of the men were shop owners and so on, but these women were constantly visiting around in each other's homes. They were active in their church, and they all seem to have registered to vote together. And of interest, I want to note Gladys, because she was married to James Hunter Martin, and according to this family member, they fought a lot. You'd hear them fighting all over Athens, but apparently there was some trouble there beyond just their marriage, because James Hunter actually committed suicide not too many years after Gladys registered to vote. And she was left with two boys, or as the family member says, two very rambunctious boys to raise on her own. But she must have done a pretty good job, because one of them went into the Army. The other one became a president of a company and went to the Reagan White House to give his input about the tariff situation. So Gladys did pretty good, all things considered. Three sisters, the Kennemers, you've got Florence, Molly, and Annie, who all lived together. They registered to vote. And their friends apparently were part of it, because Molly and Lottie both registered to vote. This is a picture from their composite class of 1916 Athens Agricultural School Aggies. They were alumna of the school together and classmates. And finally, one set of sisters, Bessie and Bonnie, the Smiths, and this is them as older ladies with Bonnie's husband, Charles Spencer. They registered to vote. So I get to with all of that said, what's the point? Pretty pictures, but why should we care if all these women registered to vote? I'd like to think that the same scenario had been playing out in small towns across the state, the South, the country. And I say small towns because, like Athens, everybody kind of knows everybody, and everybody kind of tends to be connected either through family connections or church or civic groups and organizations, or back then bridge clubs, or all of the above. And women then, and I think in a lot of ways women still today, draw strength in numbers in a way that they didn't grab picket lines and march down the street saying we want to vote, or in more recent times, they didn't burn flags, and they didn't wear pink hats and all that stuff, which is fine and wherever you are, but it doesn't go over as well and effect change as well in a small town in the South like Athens, Alabama. Sometimes as much as a woman just quietly doing what she believes to be right, and stage it in that way, and walking past men who didn't want her there, in the courthouse, in the registrar's office, in her own home perhaps, but just quietly staging a revolution. And many of these women lived independent lives before and after this. So this is just a small fraction of the stories. I'm sure there are many more stories to tell, not just here, but across the nation. But I wanted to at least highlight what it looked like to be a woman voting in Limestone County for the very first time 100 years ago this year. So with that, if you enjoyed this talk, this is who I am. The Limestone County Archivist, as you see the archives, and I'm a Rhodes Scholar for Alabama Humanities Foundation. So if you want me to come talk in person once everything opens back up, you can go to alabamahumanities.org to book me. I'm also a registered voter, but I'm not going to tell you which way I vote. It's independent. And you can reach me at, here's my email and my phone number at the archives. And then, and just as a note, if anybody likes this templates, SlidesGo requires that you include credit to them. So it's a SlidesGo template. I like using it. And with that, one last note, we have next week, we're taking a week off from the virtual Rhodes Scholar presentations for Memorial Day. Nobody wants to sit and look at their computer on Memorial Day. I don't. And the next week at 11 a.m. on June 1st, same time, same channel, Cooking in Cotton Country will premiere. And this is my copy of the Cotton Country Cooking Cookbook. And I will be opening it up to share with you how to make eggs Creole, and also telling stories of this cookbook, which was first published in 1972 by the Decatur Junior Service League in North Alabama. It's a quintessential Southern cookbook. It was given to many a bride as a wedding present, including me, and also to my sister. And a little fun thing about this show is going to be pre-recorded, but if you stick around to the end, the last 15 minutes or so, I'll be live for Q&A, but I'll be in Texas with my sister, and we'll answer your questions, and you know, she'll show you her copy of Cotton Country Cooking, and my mama's got a copy too. So those are some things you can look forward to. And with that, I will stop sharing if I can. Here we go, stop share, and go back to Melanie.
Thank you, Rebekah, for doing an excellent job again this week. And we will replay Pen Strokes of Justice on Labor Day. Please join us on June 1st for Cotton Country Cooking. I can't wait. It sounds like it's going to be an excellent presentation, cooking with a little bit of history. So now we're going to open up for a Q&A, and you can actually submit a question through the chat option. And thank you all for staying with us. I see that there's still a great group of people who are still on board.
Yes.
So please send us a question, and we can't wait to answer.
Right, and thank you for sticking as I tried to figure out my technical difficulties. This is the first time I've tried to do it with Keynote, and I can't see my cursor, so I didn't know what I was clicking on. I just randomly started clicking things until something happened. It works. Thank you for your nice comments, especially I'm glad you enjoyed the tour. I'm a little partial to my office. I think it's a beautiful place, and also the history. There's a lot that went on here that maybe that's fodder for another presentation. But as far as the photos, if you're ever interested in photos of different things from Limestone County history, we have thousands of historic photos. Some of those we have the originals, others we have, you know, negatives and scans. But if you're interested in, you know, it's I never get tired of looking at these old photos and seeing what things were like, and they get used quite a bit actually with downtown revitalization and so on around town, and be able to see the way things were.
Well, thank you, Rebekah. A lot of people are just chatting, saying thank you. They enjoyed the impromptu tour. I enjoyed that for you. And when
yes, that is Richard Martin. Okay, thanks, Richard. So Richard is the Martin family member that told me, so Martin family, if you're watching this, don't get on to him too much about talking about Gladys, but Richard is he's a hoot. I should have had him sitting here with me, but I appreciate the insight about the Martin family, Richard, and I'm glad you're here. So what got me started on this subject? Well, it was really this book that I showed y'all, but it's because if you're interested, when things open back up, the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area has a traveling exhibit called Women of the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area. And earlier this year, before everything shut down, we were the first to host it. And of course, anytime we host a traveling exhibit, I try to pull from our own collections. So in the process of researching women in Limestone County and trying to find the history on that, you know, I came across this voter registration book. We had it on display, and I just became curious about who were these women. And, you know, it's to my own chagrin sometimes. I have been really passionate about African American history in Limestone County because there's just not much. It was ignored in some cases, kind of purposely. Well, I mean, you know, the history, it was kept under the radar, it was ignored. And I've been very passionate about that. And a lot of the work that we've done with Trinity School and their records and the Fort Henderson and so on has helped to shine a light on that. And I think that's great. But then I'm a woman, and it's like I suddenly had this light bulb moment that, but what do we know about the women? Because women, you know, especially farther back you go, white women and black women had just about the same level of rights as each other. I mean, they were both, you know, beholden to men in certain ways. And so, and not able to really, their stories just weren't recorded. And so much was in the men's names. And so, I think that's a journey that I'd like to take, doing a little more discovery, highlighting that history. And I think it's something that's needed, because even like with the example of suffrage, black men got the right to vote decades before any women ever got the right to vote. And that's kind of how the rights have, and now I don't want to get, well, if I get trolls, I get trolls, but because I don't want to like stand on some sort of a, you know, stump speech about women's rights, but I'm just saying, look at the records. The women, their stories aren't, it takes digging. Just like with minorities, with any minority group, it takes more digging just to find their stories, but the stories are there. You just have to dig a little harder for them. So I hope that was not too much. That's a good question though. Let's see. Oh, that's right. Peggy Towns noted that Decatur's story about suffrage in Alabama, it was known as the home of suffrage in Alabama. And Susan B. Anthony actually came to Decatur, and so did Miss Cat, and in Huntsville. And of course, Decatur was where these men stayed for a week when they were trying to escape Tennessee. And so just to go into Decatur's story would probably be a whole nother presentation, because Decatur really kind of played prominently in Alabama and also on the national stage. So thank you for reminding me about that, Peggy. I appreciate that. And there's some books that you can, there's some books that have been written about that shine a whole lot, another light on that.
Thank you, Rebekah. All right, so it's 11:52 and we do want to end at noon. So if you have any additional questions, please go ahead and submit those at this time, and we would love to answer them. I will say, moving forward to June 1st, we do have about 14 copies of the cookbook, and we are going to give those copies away to the individuals who register. So the first 14 people who register will get a copy of the cookbook. All right, so we have a comment, Rebekah. 2 for 2, thanks. Well done, very interesting. Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Scott, for supporting us. I do want to say, you know, please invite your friends, your family members. You can share the link. I was told that this link, the link from last week, is actually being shared in Virginia. So definitely share with your friends. Go back to alabamahumanities.org, where you can find a copy online so that you can review it again. Let's see.
Oh, there's another question I see. Pen Strokes of Justice, will it be rebroadcast on Memorial Day? So it's actually available anytime right now. If you go, you tell them, Melanie.
It is available online, and it's also on YouTube, but I am going to repost it on Labor Day weekend, same time, same place. You can watch Pen Strokes of Justice. So one of the things I wanted to do this week personally, so I'm going to provide a copy of this book to the first 10 people. Sorry about that, guys. We got a virtual screen up. But to the first 10 people who register. And the title of the book is Votes for Women. So Rebekah, this morning as I was preparing for this presentation, I really thought about the first time I registered to vote. And I remember being a college student at the University of Montevallo and going to register there. Then that took me to the first time I saw my name on the ballot and had the opportunity to vote. So I'm so grateful for those women who fought for the right to vote for women in Alabama. And thank you for doing an amazing job again. And I can't wait to see you again on June 1st. Thank you all for joining us.
There's one more question that just came up. Were the women who registered to vote forced to take a literacy test? Not that I have seen in any of the records. The registration notice said that they just needed to know their ages, what precinct or ward they lived in, and then come to the commercial club to register. So good question. Okay, go on. But they did have to pay a poll tax. Okay, Melanie.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. Come back on next week for the rebroadcast of Pen Strokes for Justice, and then we'll see you June 1st, Cooking with Rebekah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.